Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks very much for joining us for the first PechaKucha of a special series, which is part of Explorathon 2021. So I'm Chris Crowley, I'm Public Engagement with Research Manager at the University of Aberdeen. But today's PechaKucha talks will include researchers from all across Scotland. So I should say a little bit first about Explorathon that these PechaKuchas are part of. So Explorathon is European Commission funded, and it's the largest public engagement with research event in Europe, and it seeks to bring research and researchers together with the public in new ways and novel ways and in fun ways. And in PechaKucha, we've really got a very fun, lively, fast-paced style of talk. I'm sure some of you know PechaKucha, some of you might be new to PechaKucha. So PechaKucha is a Japanese term which means chit-chat, and this specific style of talk or format of talk really gives the researchers 20 slides with 20 seconds to talk about each slide, and then their slide moves on automatically. So the talk is a total of 6 minutes 40 seconds for each individual talk. It's fast-paced, visual, and encompasses, a sort of wealth of research. And there is, of course, a whole wealth of research in arts and humanities topics being undertaken across Scotland. And, this is barely skimming across the surface of them. But we've got a wide variety of talks for you today. So without further ado, I shall introduce first speaker. So our first speaker comes from Edinburgh Napier University, and I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Mabel Victoria, who is talking about toilet graffiti. Specifically, what can we learn from the writing on the wall? Mabel, over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Mabel Victoria and I work with Edinburgh Napier University as a lecturer of intercultural communication. Today I'd like to share with you my research on toilet graffiti. What can we learn from the writing on the wall? When we hear the word graffiti, we probably think of something like this. So it's a form of vandalism. Many would say it's a deviant behavior, illegal, and perhaps even criminal. Indeed, graffiti writing is considered as a crime of everyday life or a victimless crime. However, the kind of toilet graffiti I'm going to talk to you about is something like this, as what you can see on the slide is more conversational, supportive, and relationship oriented. I found this graffiti by accident in May 2019. And I was fascinated by the community that I started to see that unfolded before me by going back to that particular stall. So you can see on this slide, the graffiti is very encouraging. Never doubt your own abilities. And if the writer can do it, so can you. This one is one of my most favorite. Graffiti is a conversation thread. It's about someone who's depressed and asking for advice on how to deal with the depression. You can see the different replies, complete with hearts and emojis. So for over 12 months, I've observed this particular toilet to see what we can learn from the writing on the wall in terms of the users of the toilet, in terms of what their anxieties, concerns, and beliefs are. My source of inspiration is Hammersley and Atkinson. They said that just because you don't know too much about something doesn't mean you shouldn't research it. And actually, something surprising or serendipitous can be a source of motivation for research. And speaking of serendipity, it has become some sort of inspiration for this research. So it's a combination of unplanned events, the toilet graffiti, combined with planned insights in order to generate meaningful and interesting discovery. In other words, weeks after I started observing this particular toilet stall, I formulated my research questions. I was curious about what the most popular themes are and what kind of community of users use this toilet. In a review of literature about toilet graffiti, most of the studies center around the differences between men's and women's toilet graffiti. I saw some differences from my observation. However, I'm not going to talk about these differences, but instead focus on this particular stall in the women's toilet. The recurring themes for the women's toilet is very similar to what I've already shown you earlier. It's about asking for advice and giving advice, and expressing feelings and emotions, such as feeling stressed about something, or weight loss, or how to come out as bisexual, or what to do with panic attacks. What you can see before you on this slide is just an example. This particular one was photographed in around exam time in April, May. And obviously you can see the concern of the students waiting for their exam results. Thus the need for having a prior circle. Another conversation thread during and around exam time is what you can see before you. People wishing each other love and support and hanging in there. And notice the illustrations. They also talk about academic context. Well, they always talk about academic contexts, but this one in particular is about whether to use pie charts or donuts. And there's a little bit of humor. As you can see, one saying that donuts are more delicious anyway. This is my favorite graffito. This wall does more for mental health than the uni does. Why is that? And that is my question for you, food for thought. Why would a wall do more than the university in terms of mental health? The wall was painted over 3 times over the course of my observation of several months, and there were some reactions from the toilet users about the painting over of the wall. You can see here, one person said, "Can't believe they painted the wall, sad times." Other reactions, "Bring back the wall." So you can tell that there's something safe about the anonymity of the wall that has started to build a sense of community and solidarity with the users. I must acknowledge the limitation of this study because I focus on one particular stall, and in the women's toilet, however, different toilets in different contexts where you find them will have different form of graffiti. I'd like to end the presentation with this particular writing on the wall. They can paint over a wall, but they shall never take our freedom. Again, my question to you, why graffiti? Why the wall?
Oh, Mabel, thanks very much for a really interesting talk there. And yeah, what a shame that the wall got painted over. But I guess that's life, isn't it? Things refresh, they renew, people re-engage with the wall, and on they go. And indeed, on we go as well. And now we go to Dr. Steve Greer, sorry, I should say. Steve is from the University of Glasgow, and his presentation is Live Art in Scotland, or the most important art that you've never heard about. So, over to you.
Live art is the most important field of art in Scotland that you've probably never heard about. It's a field of practice that takes most of what we assume to be true about art and its place in our lives and tries to turn those expectations on their head. This is art as mashup, with theatre, dance, visual art, film and more all sparking up against each other to create something new. This is art which is going to invite you to walk holding hands with a stranger in the street. It's art that's taking you speed dating, and it's art that has somehow persuaded you to let children cut your hair. But what is live art, and why might it matter to our understanding of art and culture in Scotland? Well, we can understand live art through another ongoing and perhaps slightly better known experiment called performance art, which emerges in the 20th century in the work of artists, primarily visual artists, who are turning away from making conventional objects like sculptures and paintings to instead work with their own bodies. And this movement develops alongside the work of artists who are similarly interested in breaking away from and expanding the traditions and practices of theatre and dance. So one of the places that live art is coming from is this combined effort to challenge the traditions which typically define art and its place in our world. But what do I mean by tradition here? Let me paint with a few broad strokes. So, if I ask you to picture theatre, there's a good chance your mental image includes something like this: a particular kind of stage with curtains behind a proscenium arch, and perhaps a particular style of performance that might even be attached to a particular body of work, a kind of literary canon of works that you may well have studied at school. And similarly, if I ask you to think about dance, there's a good chance an image of something like this has come to mind, of a particular kind of body, moving in a particular stylized fashion, wearing particular clothes. And we recognize this as dance even if we don't know much of anything about dance. And within both of those images, and perhaps other ones besides, you might have a sense of how cultural forms are arranged in a kind of hierarchy of imagined importance, with things like painting and opera and dramatic theatre and ballet positioned as a thing called high culture, with other forms of cultural expression and art, like stand-up comedy or circus or carnival and television, in the middle or somewhere down towards the bottom of the pile. Now, part of what live art does is, or tries to do, is throw those judgments into the air by pushing these different art forms into conversation with each other, mashing them together to create new forms of expression. And it does this because one of the recurring problems with conventional histories and definitions of art and culture is that they work to police what kinds of human activity or experience might count as culture. In the field of dance, for example, it might include unmarked beliefs about the kinds of bodies that can be involved in making dance and the kinds of movements that might count as dance at all. And so many of the artists who've been involved in the development of live art here in Scotland and elsewhere have been motivated by a desire to create new and more expansive forms of expression and representation. And that means expanding the people and communities who've been involved in making and enjoying art. A central part of my project, the Live Art in Scotland project, is an attempt to trace the conditions in which this kind of creative experimentation becomes possible, and then to see the role that this innovation has played and continues to play in Scottish culture. Now, what the history of live art reveals is this most often involves breaking away from the conventional institutions in which art is most often imagined to live. Now, galleries and theatres can be monumentally beautiful. They can be cathedrals, if you like, to their art forms, and they enable experiences which are not easily achievable anywhere else. But they can also act as scenes of constraint. And this is because the white box of the gallery and the black box of the theatre are not neutral spaces, even when they're empty. They come with habits. They offer specific shapes or containers for art that carry rules, if not invitations, for how we might engage with art. A painting hanging on a wall is an invitation to stand at a certain distance and to not touch the art. And similarly, a seat in a darkened auditorium carries the tacit instructions to sit still, to remain quiet, and to take a largely passive observational role while the action plays out in front of us. Now, live art doesn't hold all the answers, and there are other art forms which challenge those kinds of beliefs, and live art can be very easily incorporated within these kinds of institutional settings and can fall into the same trap of fixing on a really narrow band of work and then adopting some of the same expectations for artistic presentation. But where live art might be particularly valuable and really important to understanding cultural innovation is in its tendency to continually challenge rules and expectations which surround art and which hold art forms and their communities at distance. It's an invitation, if you like, to take clubbing to the opera or ballet to a comedy club and to see what happens when those forms and their communities speak to each other. And so it becomes more broad. It becomes an invitation to rethink and remake our conditions for living. And for this reason, it's sometimes called a cultural strategy rather than an artistic movement. And this is because it's art that grows from communities and contexts, relationships, rather than in fixed or reproducible works. And this is a dynamic that maybe invites us to reconsider the role of the box office or the market in funding culture. And so live art is art on a Sunday afternoon in Aberdeenshire, which is asking the people who live there what it means to be a father and exploring the 100 different forms that fatherhood might take. It's art that is inviting you to stop and slow down, to be held and comforted, to share a moment where there are no expectations for you to speak, but where there is a chance for you to be heard and maybe even understood without saying a word. This is a form of art which is stopping traffic as it travels from the centre of Queen's Park in Glasgow down the high street and making a scene and drawing us and passers-by into a new encounter with public space and making us think about what it is to be a body in public space and to think about why certain bodies are treated differently in their claim on public space. And so it's art that wants you to walk holding hands with a stranger, and in that action start to think about or see your hometown in a new light, or just to learn something from an encounter with a stranger whose life is entirely different from your own, but with whom you might still find yourself sharing an intimate experience. And for all of those reasons and more, that's why live art might be important.
Well, Steve, again, an absolutely fantastic, interesting, intriguing talk about, again, aspects of art that I just simply had no clue about. And this is what's really good about PechaKucha is, you're always learning, and there's so many different things that's going on out there. But on a slightly more serious topic, Professor Sarah Pedersen from Robert Gordon University, which is based in Aberdeen, is talking about the impact of COVID on the provision of domestic abuse support in the north of Scotland. So, Sarah, it's over to you.
A pandemic within a pandemic. That's how the growth in reports of domestic violence during the COVID-19 lockdown has been described. With the imposition of lockdown in many countries, people were required to spend the majority of their time in their own homes. And for some women, this has meant being in lockdown with their abusers. In spring 2021, we ran a project investigating how lockdown had impacted on service providers of domestic violence support in Aberdeen, Aberdeenshire and Orkney. So we were investigating the impact of lockdown on urban, rural and island communities. We talked to the managers of organisations that provided support and asked them how they had coped. Our project was supported by Aberdeen Violence Against Women's Partnership, Grampian and Orkney Women's Aid, the Cyrenians and Victim Support Scotland, and many other groups, including Aberdeen and Orkney councils. Funding was provided by Robert Gordon University to employ a research assistant who interviewed the managers. After an initial drop-off right at the start of lockdown, all the organisations had seen a steep increase in the demand for their services. Indeed, one provider told us that they had seen a staggering 400% increase in demand in the year from March 2020. Several organisations also reported an increase in high-risk referrals. Because of this increase in demand, the majority of providers had been forced to introduce waiting lists, and for some, this was the first time they'd ever done this in several decades of service. Those on the waiting lists were prioritised by need, but some survivors still were left waiting for months before they were assigned a key worker to support them and counsel them. At the same time, refugees could not take in new arrivals because the women already there found it impossible to move out. And when a property did become empty, lockdown meant it was very difficult to clean and refurbish it. The closure of the laundry in Orkney, for example, meant that used beddings and towels had to be stored rather than cleaned, and new provided continually. One unexpected finding was that lockdown led to an increase in the number of historic abuse cases being reported. It seems that the experience of lockdown gave survivors the necessary extra time to revisit buried memories, and service providers reported survivors coming forward with stories of abuse that had occurred up to 30 or 40 years ago. Like everyone else, the staff who were supporting survivors had to learn how to work from home. And this brought its own problems, particularly in terms of connectivities in rural and island areas. Not all staff members or volunteers had laptops or mobile phones that actually worked at home. The good news is that funders were very flexible and proactive and allowed the money that had been allocated for travel, for example, to be spent instead on the provision of tablets and phones. However, while the majority of staff were already proficient users of computer technology, some third sector organisations reported problems with some volunteers who were resistant to the use of technology, such as apps. The assumption had been that service users would use video communication tools like Zoom to speak to staff, but it soon became clear that users would much prefer to use their phones. And there were lots of reasons for this: ease of access, concerns about privacy, lack of easy access to the internet, and fears that it was easier for an abuser to track a woman's contacts via computer. It was also clear that many service users prefer to access support and counselling via telephone rather than have a one-to-one meeting. Several interviewees suggested that this was because the public nature of such meetings marked someone out as a domestic abuse survivor. It was easier to talk by phone. Working from home also brought problems relating to confidentiality for staff, particularly since many of them were juggling their work responsibilities with childcare and homeschooling. After the initial months of lockdown, however, it became possible to allow staff members to access offices by rota, and that really helped, particularly with access to broadband. Working at home obviously also affected on the mental health of staff. The need to concentrate on the telephone with no physical cues when talking to survivors meant that staff needed to work much harder to make a friendly connection. And at the end of a difficult call, there was no one around as there would be in the office to help them debrief. Those supporting children faced even bigger problems in terms of access, particularly because children did not respond well to telephone calls. Now, normally staff would go into schools to support them. Socially distanced walks were introduced, and also there was the innovative use of programs such as Minecraft to attempt to continue to support children. One of the biggest problems was the closure of the courts. Some women were actually in the middle of a case when lockdown was imposed, and then they had to wait months for it to resume. This obviously impacted on their mental health and extended the time and the resources that were needed to support them through it. More positively, it's clear that organisations, the police and the media work together to support survivors and share information and innovation. Since meetings of violence against women partnerships had now moved online, it was easier for participants to attend, and attendance rates skyrocketed. There were particular concerns that abusers were using lockdown to extend their control. Organisations again worked with local police forces and in particular the local media to get the message out there that those suffering abuse were allowed to leave lockdown to seek shelter. Another positive about the shift to online is that training sessions for staff and national meetings were much easier to attend for those living in northern Scotland. And there was a fervently expressed wish that this sort of flexible approach would continue, given the costs in time and money of travelling to the Central Belt for meetings. Organisations also told us that they were completely committed to continuing this flexible approach to their provision of support, particularly given the positive response to the use of telephone-based help. Survivors will now be offered the option of online, telephone or face-to-face meetings, or a mixture of all three. The clear message that came out of our research was that service providers had coped by being flexible and by working together. But the stress on staff, managers and service users was clear, and there were concerns about funding for services in the future. However, as one interviewee said, if something like this happened again, at least we would know better that we can cope with it.
Well, thank you very much for that, Sarah. So moving on, next up for PechaKucha, we have Ashleigh James Brown. So Ashleigh is from the artist-led collective Non-Random, which works alongside researchers from various organisations, but including the University of Edinburgh and St Andrews. So Ashleigh's presentation tonight is entitled Evolving Ourselves with Unnatural Selection, a Sci-Art research project. So Ashleigh, over to you.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this presentation about the project Evolving Ourselves with Unnatural Selection, a creative research and development arts project funded by Creative Scotland. Hi, we're Non-Random. We're an artist collective and we work at the intersection of arts and science researches. Oh, there we are. Let me introduce you to all of us. Dr. Linda O'Keefe, whose specialism is sound, Dr. Tony Doyle, whose specialism is data sonification, and Ashleigh James Brown, whose specialism is audiovisual graphics. Evolving Ourselves with Unnatural Selection is a year-long research and development project where we're exploring the ethics and language around some of these new scientific technologies, in particular the field of CRISPR gene editing technology. We're going to explore and present some of the implications through a multi-arts approach. We believe that our creative approach and experience of making works for a public audience, combined with the scientific fact and knowledge, will make for a truly interesting research and development project. This project is a true SciArts collaboration, and we have a number of partners, consultants, and collaborators that are working with us. We use a variety of online tools so that we can keep our process, methods and approaches completely transparent and open and visible to all. In the early stages of this project, whilst working remotely, we spent a lot of time reading a variety of texts, the basics of CRISPR, visual interactions, data sonification and the extinction of plants, a plethora of information to help ground us in our beginnings. As COVID rules relaxed and changed, we were finally able to meet together to take a residency in person. This enabled us to not only just use real post-it notes for the first time this year, but also share the work that we were doing and work in a real collaborative space together. Working with focus groups was a real integral part of the research process. This enabled us to work with a variety of artists, scientists, academics, researchers, to understand their opinions on the topics. Here is a choice selection of some of the quotes. Working with all of the focus groups led to very interesting discussions, with some shared opinions and differing ones also. Using some data capture, we were able to look at some of the language and pick out some of the words that were most frequent in the discussion. One of the other things we're trying to do is capture data in creative and playful ways. We're doing this by building scenarios, fictional worlds that are rooted in scientific modelling and fact, but taken with a bit of creative freedom to present ideas that will gather people's thoughts. Our world is currently taking inspiration from early computer games such as The Sentinel that offered creative world building and future fantastic worlds that we could only dream of. We've been looking at how we can create a soundscape for each of our domes which reflect the current themes that are within. And this is quite a difficult concept as we've got 5 very complex ideas. But let's have a quick listen to what our future human dome sounds like. Science fiction and the movies have a real fascination with the term mutant and mutation. We're often see it as quite polarised though, with superheroes and super villains, and in reality that's not always the case. Throughout 2020 and 21, we've seen a lot of science reporting in the media. We've seen heroes, we've seen villains. Social media has also concentrated on whether a person can operate a slideshow rather than the facts that are contained within. So what are we trying to achieve with our project? Well, we're looking at the ethical implications and future of gene editing through creative experimental approaches, online interactive media that we're going to share with a public audience. Our online blog is where we're looking to share some of these creative works throughout the later half of 2021. We also post regular updates about the project there. Here's a sneak preview at some of the machine learning generated artwork that we've created. We've used natural language processing, which allows us to give the machine a sentence and it attempts to navigate the neural net and create a piece of art. I'll let you decide what we might have asked the machine. We've launched Gaia, which is our online survey world space. It's playful, it's interactive. You can immerse yourself, experience our future fictional world, and answer questions and queries around the ethics and implications of gene editing. Next, We want to take this further. Once this period of research and development is done, our hope is to continue with the experimentation and build with new technologies innovative ways to experience this topic. We aim to have a gallery exhibit that will tour in 2022. As a collective, Non-Random is all about working with scientists to create meaningful collaborations that allow us to share creative work to public audiences. We're always open to new conversations, and we look forward to hearing from anyone who'd like to work with us. Thank you so much for watching, and take care.
Well, thanks very much for that, Ashleigh. Really, really interesting presentation. And finally tonight, we move on to Ashleigh Black, who is a PhD student at the University of Aberdeen. And Ashleigh's talk is entitled The Poisonous Art of 19th Century Photography. So, Ashleigh, over to you.
Good evening, my name is Ashleigh. I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of Aberdeen researching the George Washington Wilson photographic collection. I'm going to be speaking to you about the poisonous art of 19th century photography. Born in Aberdeenshire in 1823, Wilson initially trained as a miniature portrait artist before entering into photography in the early 1850s. In 1873, GWW & Co was formed. Based in St Swithin Street, his photographic firm manufactured images on an industrial scale. In 1826, Joseph Niepce had succeeded in capturing what is considered to be the world's first photograph. In 1835, the first negative was created by William Henry Fox Talbot, and in 1839, the daguerreotype took the world by storm, dubbed the mirror with a memory for its distinctive silver shine. Early photographers were known as practitioners of the black art. Their name was derived from the dark silver stains they would get on their hands after using silver nitrate. The only way to remove these stains was to wash their hands in a solution of potassium cyanide, effectively burning the stains out of their skin. Potassium cyanide is a compound and looks like small granules of sugar. Cyanide poisoning can occur in three ways: by digestion, inhalation, and absorption. Collodion is the resulting viscous solution that you get when you mix gun cotton in ether. It was used to coat the photographic glass plates, which were then drained and secured in a light-tight box, ready to be placed into the camera for exposure. In 1851, Frederick Scott Archer published his collodion process and determined that it was far more effective to coat the glass plates in collodion than albumen, which was made from egg whites, as had previously been favoured. Wilson intended his practical guide to be read by students, but instead chose to publish it so as to attract a wider audience. On the whole, Wilson's book is much more condensed and is comprised of more comprehensive lists of equipment and chemicals. Wilson's guide is concise and also contains illustrations, something which Archer's manual did not include. Essentially, this was a user-friendly guide to the wet collodion process. Minus the equipment also mentioned by Wilson, these are the essential chemicals of his collodion process. Although potassium cyanide is not in this list, it still would have been used as it was the staple of any photographer's repertoire. Photography was a relatively universal medium, available to those who could afford to buy the chemicals required for the process and, of course, the camera. So it attracted both the amateur and the professional. The vast majority of these chemicals were sold over the counter and did not require a special license or dispensation. Many caustic chemicals formed parts of the Victorian household. Lead was used in white paint, which coated fencing and children's toys, and arsenic was found in wallpaper because it emitted such a vibrant green colour. For each of the slides about these chemicals, I have included a photograph from the Wilson collection to emphasise the risks that he and others were taking to achieve such stunning images. Glacial acetic acid or ice vinegar is highly combustible and corrosive, and continued inhalation causes bronchitis. Silver nitrate is highly corrosive. It can cause a myriad of health problems, including gastrointestinal disorders, blindness, vertigo, seizures, and coma. It reacts with sodium chloride to form silver chloride, which is a light-sensitive emulsion. Like potassium cyanide, pyrogallic acid can also be absorbed through the skin. Inhalation causes cyanosis, anemia, seizures, and kidney and liver damage. It acted as a developing agent in the photographic process. Externally, the effects of gold chloride can cause reactions on the skin. It can also be inhaled if the photographer was not careful, and if ingested is highly toxic. Cyanosis occurs as a result of inhalation, where the fingers and toes turn blue due to the restriction of the flow of oxygen. Spirits of wine was a common nickname for aquavitae, or pure ethanol, which can cause irritation to the skin and also blindness. The first documented distillation of aquavitae was recorded in Italy in 1150. In 1865, the British Journal of Photography recorded an incident where an amateur photographer was sold a large quantity of cyanide over the counter. Unable to fit the lumps into his vials, he bit the lump in two and surprisingly did not die. After his retirement, Wilson's health began to decline. He suffered seizures and lapses in memory towards the last few weeks of his life. Undoubtedly, exposure to such toxic chemicals had taken its toll, and he died surrounded by his family in 1893. To conclude, the dangers and risks to life that photographers faced were significant. The vast majority of early photography was experimental, so Wilson and his contemporaries were stepping into the unknown. The legacy that Wilson left us amounts to 38,000 glass plate negatives. Thank you.
Okay, Ashleigh, thanks very much. I mean, indeed, yes, who knew quite how dangerous 19th century photography was? Dangerous chemicals, dangerous processes and elements. So there, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much to all the speakers for their fantastic talks, as they cover a variety of different aspects of arts and humanities research that's been undertaken across Scotland. So, as I say, this is the first in a series of special PechaKuchas, so do look at the Explorathon website, www.explorathon.co.uk, or our Facebook page. Look us up on Facebook and you'll see all the other PechaKuchas that are coming along. Do take a moment to fill out the evaluation that's part of this, because evaluation is incredibly important. But once again, I'd really like to thank Mabel, Steve, Sarah and Ashleigh for a fantastic series of presentations. So thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen, and hope to see you at the next PechaKucha. Thanks. Bye-bye.